Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Sean Carleton, a settler scholar and associate professor in the departments of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. Carleton has done work on residential school denialism, or the attempt by some to twist, misrepresent, or downplay truths about residential schooling. In 2023, he co-authored Debunking the Mass Grave Hoax, a report on media coverage and residential school denialism in Canada. Carleton also recently collaborated with Ellen Gabriel on the book When the Pine Needles Fall, an intimate look into Gabriel's life leading up to the siege of Ganasatake. Sean, thanks so much for being with us on the show this week.
Thanks for having me.
As mentioned there, you do a lot of work on truth and reconciliation, and it's been a busy few months with the National Day, the release of the special Interlocutor's final report, and of course, the passing of Murray Sinclair. And let's start there, I guess, on how you reflect on the life and legacy of somebody who's had such a monumental impact on this country.
Yeah, I mean, I think quite simply, Murray Sinclair changed Canada forever. There's no going back as a result of his tireless work to advocate for Indigenous people, but in particular, his work with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? That's a true gift, and his passing is a profound loss for people doing this work. But I did have the good fortune of attending his memorial service here in Winnipeg with my family to pay respects. And I think what struck me is that he really believed in a better future, that we can do this hard work and come through the other side to develop a better society. And with his passing, I think that torch now passes to all of us to continue his work to advocate for truth and justice and healing and reconciliation.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that, how can any one person ever carry on all that work, like you say, tireless work, but it is really up to everyone, right?
I think it's a collective responsibility. He makes that very clear in the Truth and Reconciliations Commission's final report, right? Where he says, reconciliation is not an Indigenous problem or a burden, right, for Indigenous people. It is a Canadian responsibility. It is a collective responsibility to figure out ways to build better relationships and develop a better society for everyone. I do think that it took a toll on him. The work of helping support survivors, touring across the country. His family talked about the consequences for him personally of dealing with that difficult work. So I think with his passing, it's now again up to us to shoulder some of that responsibility and figure out ways to continue his work moving forward.
With all these things that have been happening in recent months, I guess, where do you feel that Canada is on the journey to reconciliation?
Yeah, I mean, I get that question a lot, particularly from my students. Where are we at with reconciliation? I guess as a non-Indigenous person, I'm not always the best person to answer that question. But I think from my perspective, what I see is that Canada is stalling on its commitments to truth and reconciliation. Even if we just look at the 94 calls to action, we're almost a decade out from the final report being released. And Canada has only completed 13 of the calls to action, many of them the most symbolic, not the deep systemic calls to action that really need to be implemented. So I think that if we look at the political level, we are seeing Canada start to stall, right? Murray Sinclair always would say that he thought that Canada was rushing reconciliation and leaving the truth behind. And as a result, that momentum behind truth and reconciliation, was stalling. But I'm also an optimist. And I think that while at the political level, things have stalled, I think on the social level, we are seeing many Canadians now understand the truth of residential schools and taking the calls to participate in reconciliation seriously. Before the TRC's release, I couldn't have imagined, almost 20,000 people in the streets of Winnipeg on the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation marching. So I think that on a social level, we're seeing momentum, but on a political level, especially federally, we are seeing that stall. So much work remains.
Somewhat to the political level, I do want to talk about the special interlocutors on missing children and on Mark Graves' final report. How important did you see Kimberly Murray's role over the last few years?
I think she's worked very closely with communities who are doing the work to learn the full truth of the legacy of schools where their children attended. I think similar to Murray Sinclair, the work is very difficult. I mean, she's dealing with a sensitive issue, of course. Thinking about missing and deceased children at these schools, I know that is difficult work. But I think her report, like the Truth and Reconciliation report, gives Canadians tools to be able to understand that truth, but also to work towards healing and justice, which are the preconditions for reconciliation as the TRC report lays out. So I think in time, the work that Kimberly Murray has done will only add more layers and tools in the toolkit to work towards reconciliation, although admittedly it is difficult and ongoing work for sure.
One of the recommendations was the establishment of a commission of investigations into the enforced disappearance of Indigenous children in Canada. How important would you see that commission?
Well, I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was really important because it established beyond doubt the truth of residential schooling, that it was a genocidal school system designed to undermine Indigenous lifeways and facilitate colonialism and capitalism. And I think that has been very important work. But one of the things it did not do is necessarily deal with the prosecution of those who are committing those crimes against humanity. That was part of the process of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to get people, to share their truths, was also creating, an environment where people felt that they could talk about those truths openly. But the issue of justice was put on the side. Right. And there are still people living in Canada and around the world who are responsible for what happened in residential schooling that are not facing that justice. And so I think Kimberly Murray's suggestion, her recommendation, that international observers be involved to facilitate that kind of justice is an important call because Canadians are in favor of reconciliation, but how far they're willing to go to hold people accountable, particularly on a political level, I think there's a gap there. And so international tools, the International Criminal Court, for example, has refused to investigate. And I know that Kimberly Murray has asked that be reconsidered. I know that the Assembly of First Nations has supported the call to open that investigation. And I think if Canadians have nothing to hide, then we shouldn't be fearful of an international investigation into those responsible for residential schools. That seems like something that you would be open to do if you were in favor of getting to the root of this to move forward.
Well, speaking of the political will, given that this government quietly capped the funding to First Nations around the work of unmarked graves, do you see the Liberals or any other government actually committing the 20 years worth of funding that the Interlocutors report is calling for?
Well, I mean, I think the news about the capping of funding for communities is a good example of perhaps what's required for us moving forward. Is they made that announcement hoping that there wouldn't be a backlash or an outcry, and there was. And they got their feet held to the fire, and they had to reverse that, not because they wanted to, right, but because they were being held accountable, not only by people like Kimberly Murray and Indigenous communities doing the work, but also Canadians who understand that this is our time to understand the truth. So let's do it. This is our moment. And so I think there is a possibility that governments get behind this, right? That it takes in some ways it off the political shoulders, that we need to continue to do that work it needs to be Indigenous-led, and that we can look back on this moment as the time that Canada had the courage to really commit to this, rather than continue to punt it down to future generations to deal with. So I'm hopeful that that same kind of political pressure that reversed that funding can also push politicians, regardless of political party, onto the path of supporting this much needed investigation.
Sean, much more to talk about here, especially on the truth side of things. We just need to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Sean Carleton. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Sean Carleton, an associate professor of history and Indigenous studies at the University of Manitoba. And Sean, before the break, we were talking about the special interlocutor's final report, and she also spoke about something she called settler amnesty and residential school denialism. How, as somebody who talks about this a lot, how would you describe denialism?
Well, I mean, first we need to understand that most residential school denialists are not denying that residential schools happened. As I said at the top of the show, we're not going back, from where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has established the truth. So denialists are not denying that residential schools existed or even that the school system had negative impacts. Instead, what they're doing is they're downplaying or distorting or minimizing basic facts about the residential school system to try and shake public confidence in truth and reconciliation. And in this way, this kind of denialism is similar to other denialism that we are seeing proliferate in our age of mis and disinformation, things like science denialism or climate denialism. But in this case, it's being used to create a backlash narrative. And try and stall some of that momentum on truth and reconciliation quite clearly.
There is no doubt, I don't think in any way, that there's been this rise in residential school denialism since the discovery of the 215 anomalies in Kamloops. Why do you think that we're seeing such a rise?
Well, I mean, I think first, we can really see a lot of the people engaging in denialism now starting out around the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, trying to undermine the truth of that, trying to delegitimize Murray Sinclair, for example. And after the Kamloops announcement in 2021, I think a lot of Canadians, were shocked and surprised. I think a lot of people knew about abuse in residential schools, the attack on culture. But I think that a lot of Canadians didn't realize that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission showed the documented deaths at the time of more than 3,000, and that number has since increased as a result of communities continuing to do research. It's now up to more than 4,000. Mm-hmm. And I think Canadians just didn't know that was also part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings. And the Kamloops announcement brought that to light. And I think it shocked a lot of Canadians, and as a result, it gave new momentum behind truth and reconciliation work. Okay, we need to figure this out and find ways to move forward. And denialists didn't like that. Denialists want to keep Canada the way that it is because it benefits them. They like the colonial status quo. They derive their power and privilege and profit from the way that Canada is. And so in the moment where Canadians were putting more political pressure behind supporting Indigenous communities to get to the bottom of this, denialists were trying to undermine confidence in this to try and stall that momentum, throw an anchor on truth and reconciliation. And they targeted residential school truths, the truths of survivors and Indigenous communities as a way of creating this backlash
These used to be opinions that were on the fringe. Now when you, as I mentioned to you, you do an internet search of Kamloops unmarked graves, which I did yesterday, and among the first things that pop up are not just places like the Frontier Center, but it's the National Post, the New York Post. It seems as though it's gone mainstream. Why do you think that is?
Well, a couple of things. First, I would say that it has certainly proliferated from the extreme far right into the more mainstream right wing. I wouldn't say that it has become mainstream. I don't think that the majority of Canadians, for example, are out there thinking residential schools were well intentioned. It was of the times. Abuses were, didn't happen. Deaths didn't happen in these schools. I think it has become part of a right wing identity that has moved from the fringe into more respectable space on the political right. And I think it's because it gives people who feel like they're not currently in political power a way of pushing back against certain things. It makes them feel emboldened, right? And so I think they're drawing on the American rights playbook of how to change the conversation and gain political power through it. And so they feel like Truth and Reconciliation is an attack on Canada rather than an opportunity to improve relationships. And so they're engaging in this type of behavior as a backlash, as a way of fomenting anti-Indigenous hatred, but also to try and grab political power over it, right? They will say, Canadians have been misled and guilted into caring about truth and reconciliation, right? And I think they're trying to use that to their political advantage.
We mentioned off the top too, you co-authored a report called Debunking the Mass Grave Hoax. Can you tell us a bit about why you felt there was a need for such a report and a little on the findings?
Yeah, so the mass grave hoax conspiracy theory started in the summer of 2021 as part of this backlash that I'm talking about on the extreme far right. It was devised by people working for Rebel News and other far right media outlets in conversation with some priests. There was a priest in Edmonton who, in response to the Kamloops news, was calling it a big lie. And so they tried to develop a backlash narrative that could be politically useful, that we have seen make incursions into the mainstream on the right. And essentially, in short, what the mass grave hoax conspiracy theory is doing is, again, drawing on the American right playbook from the Sandy Hook massacre. So for those viewers out there, what people like Alex Jones, who ran InfoWars, which was sort of a right-wing platform in the US, took media errors in the initial reporting of the Sandy Hook massacre, which, as you know, as a journalist, happens quite frequently as you're trying to figure out a complicated situation in live time. And they pounced on those errors and they said, see, look at these errors in reportage. This is proof that the government and the media are, involved in a conspiracy to pass gun laws to take away your guns, right? And despite it being clearly out there, people who want to protect their guns started to believe in this conspiracy theory and spread it. So taking a page out of that playbook, these far-right extremists pounced on some media errors that didn't understand what Kamloops and other nations like Cowessess were reporting, which was not a mass grave, but rather evidence of potential unmarked graves using a variety of technology, from ground-penetrating radar to archival research. And what they did is they pounced on these few errors, and then they spun it into saying, this is universally how Canadians were learning about this situation. And so that was not my experience. And so myself and a graduate student decided to actually do the work of looking into what reporters and journalists were actually saying in that spring, summer, and fall of 2021? Were they reporting universally that this was mass graves where bodies had been found? And of course, what we found was that only 6.5% of the articles that we looked at in mainstream news outlets used those phrases. 93.5% of journalists actually got it right in a complicated time where they were learning about ground penetrating radar and what communities were saying on the fly. They got it right. So essentially what the mass grave hoax conspiracy theory is doing is twisting a small amount of error. They're cherry picking those errors and they're blowing this up into a conspiracy theory that they can use to say Canadians are being misled about these findings, about the work that's going on. And we really shouldn't trust the media. We shouldn't trust the government. We shouldn't trust Indigenous nations doing this work. We can go back to not caring about reconciliation. And I think that is a very dangerous development. So part of this report was doing the hard work of showing that they were wrong so that we can move forward with this important work.
Sean, much more that we hope to get to here. We just have to step aside for one more quick break and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Sean Carleton, the Assistant Professor of History and Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. And Sean, we did want to talk about this book that you collaborated with Ellen Gabriel called When the Pine Needles Fall, Indigenous Acts of Resistance. Can you tell us about the book and how you came to be part of it?
Yeah, well, the book in short is about the life and legacy of Ellen Gabriel, who was the Mohawk spokesperson during the summer of 1990 during the Mohawk resistance. But it also showcases all the incredible work that she has done since that summer as a land defender, as a feminist activist, as a human rights activist, and someone who supports Indigenous people. And I got to meet Ellen where I was doing my PhD out in Peterborough in Ontario, and we became friends, and I felt that it was a great injustice that she did not have a book, that people could learn directly from her about that summer and the lessons that it holds for Indigenous land defenders, but also for everyone in Canada. And so we decided to collaborate to make this book so that people could have the opportunity to learn directly from her for future generations.
Of course, not the only book out there that you've been part of, Sean. We're short on time here, but just wanted to talk about why this is work that you wanted to be involved with. I mean, anybody that follows you on Twitter knows that you faced a lot of backlash over all of this as well, too. But why is this work that you've committed to?
I think as an educator, I take Murray Sinclair's saying to heart, right? That education is what got us into this mess, and education is what's going to get us out. And so I feel passionate about whether it's teaching or working with people like Ellen Gabriel to help, people connect to role models that really are working towards healing and justice and reconciliation and decolonization. It's a role that I think, everyone can play, and you need other kinds of role models. And as a non-Indigenous person, I take seriously Murray Sinclair's point that this needs to be, that non-Indigenous people have a role to play in building better relationships. And I hope that through my work, I can help model what that can look like moving forward.
Awesome stuff. Well, Sean, wish we had you for an hour here, but it's great to have you on the show and to chat with you here. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
That is all the time we have for the show this week. We did go a bit over time, so if you want to hear the whole interview, visit our APTN News YouTube page, or you can listen to the full edition on the APTN Facebook face-to-face podcast, where you can find those wherever you download your podcasts. All our other past shows are there as well. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for being with us this week on Face to Face. We'll see you back here in 7 days.